Good afternoon, and welcome to, again, our weekly Bible study. I trust wherever you're at, you're enjoying a beautiful day. Today here in Springfield, Missouri is just a fantastic day, balmy 60s, and after you've been in the 20s and 30s, it feels hot, doesn't it? Of course, the day will be when we hit August of this year, and this 60 will feel like we're freezing to death. But anyway, it's all relative after a while. Well, we may finish, Daniel today. Don't know. I'm going to try. Now if my clicker will work. Come on. Sounds like we're all having technical difficulties today. So as I'm doing that, trying to get this to move, let's just kind of quickly review where we're at. Daniel is in his late 80s. It's about 3 years after the Persian Empire, or Persia, conquered Babylon. So Daniel has been transferred from Babylon to the capital of Persia, which is Susa. He must have found favor very quickly with the Persian king. And so he is one of 3 key leaders in his administration. And see if I can talk and push the button at the same time. And there are some people that are jealous of him. He must have had the ear of the king, and they weren't very happy. We're going to find out a little bit that it may have had something to do with his background, his genetic, the fact that he was Jewish, which may have contributed a little bit to this feeling that they didn't want him around anymore. And so they lay a plot. And we ended it last time that they had convinced the king to set aside 30 days, and no one could pray to anyone or acknowledge anyone as the supreme being, whatever they wanted to call it, except for the king himself. And that's kind of how we ended it. And Rochelle, I may have to, it's not wanting to move me to my next, oh, there we go. Okay. So he signs this decree. It's the law of the Medes and the Persians. And so we're just going to pick up with the story. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went and did his normal routine, knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with his windows open towards Jerusalem. And he did this 3 times a day. Now, as we mentioned before, Daniel had 3 options when he found out about this decree. 1, he could cease to pray and obey the law of the land, and everything would move forward. I'm not so sure, though, that those that were jealous of Daniel would have given up. They would have tried to find some other way to get at him, because it wasn't over his praying that they were upset about. It was over the fact that he must have had the ear of the king, and they wanted to have that influence that Daniel seemed to have. He also could have prayed privately or in secret. In other words, he could have said, I'm going to make this a private thing. And you hear this even now, that religion's okay, but you need to keep it private. It has no bearing in coming in. So we don't want prayer in public in any way, shape, or form. We don't want any acknowledgement of the things of God in the public forum. And so there are many people that have bought into the fact that that is an option for them to consider. And what it does is it muzzles the fact that we are whole people. When you talk to me, it's not just talking to Duane the secular, there's Duane the spiritual. There's, in totality. And so then his other option, which we know the story, he continued to pray as usual. What I see in the life of Daniel is a strong consistency. When I talk with my students, I talk about 2 things that I think are important in their lives. The big one is discipline, but kind of as an outgrowth of that is consistent application of that discipline. In other words, if today I'm going to be disciplined and tomorrow I'm not going to be disciplined, if I'm trying to follow that person, there's no clear direction. Try to parent, and one day you're going to be disciplined and one day you're not going to be disciplined. What are the kids going to do? They're going to be so frustrated, and it's not going to go well. They say whether you're conservative or liberal with your kids, what's key for them is consistency. They know where the boundaries are because you consistently apply it. And so one of the credible, besides the fact that he's a man of integrity, is his consistency, that he did not allow the political whims and everything else that's going on around him to influence the things that he felt were important to him. And so then it goes on. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house. So he goes and does his thing, and they go and follow him to his house. Must have been a big house, whatever. Don't know where they were at. And they found him praying and asking God for help. So that's what they do. So immediately they go straight to the king and they remind him about the law. Notice here, they do not bring up the fact that Daniel's the issue yet. They're laying a trap for the king, and they've put the king already in a bind, and they're just reminding him of the bind he's in. And what's the bind? He made this law, and this law cannot be changed. So they went straight to the king, reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone other than you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? So just keep it fresh in your mind, king. And the king said, oh, yes, yes, I remember doing that. Thought that was a great idea. Okay. And the decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Okay. So they're kind of talking to themselves. You ever had a conversation where you're having one conversation in your head and the other person's having another conversation in their head? I think that's what's happening here. These people are having one conversation. Of course, Daniel's in the back of their mind, and the king's having another conversation in his head. The words are being changed, but their understanding and how they're being applied are worlds apart. Classic case of this here. So let's move on. Then they told the king. Now they spring the trap. That man, Daniel, and this is why I think his Jewish heritage was part of the issue here. Because otherwise, why bring this up? This is over 70 years later. It'd be like bringing up something that happened when you were a teenager. Do you remember back? They says, that man, Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, as if everyone's supposed to know what that means. Well, obviously, it meant something. And obviously, it's very clear that we're speaking to Daniel's heritage. So again, I think Daniel, without blatantly talks about it, is showing us, again, that anti-Semitism that they experienced throughout the captivity. And this man, this one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. It has nothing to do with worship, prayer. It's about the king. So they're posturing their argument. So again, the king had the law that couldn't get out, but they're also making it very personal. It says he's attacking you, which would just have made the king, if he responded in the way they thought he would, just even more aggravated and ready to punish Daniel. Because who is anyone to challenge me? I'm the king of the vast, vast empire. Now, our president doesn't look anything like kings, but imagine if someone goes toe-to-toe, face-to-face with the president. It doesn't usually go well. They have this idea that I'm the president. Okay, now multiply that by 100-fold, and you start getting the idea of what the king is thinking here. And so he's ignoring you. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. What God? That Jewish God. Okay, because one of the captives from Judah. So hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. In the actual word, it means he was greatly distressed. Okay, and to the point of being furious about what's happening. He's deeply troubled. Why? Because he realized he was taken. They had sprung a trap, and he was part of the issue. Remember when we did Esther, the exact same thing happened when Haman laid the trap for the Jews over Mordecai. And when the king finds out, because sometimes they're in la-la land, who knows where they're at, and they're doing things and they're not really thinking it through. When they realize they've been duped and they've been tricked into doing something, they're furious. So the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. All right. So immediately things didn't happen. There's a day that goes by. Okay. He's furious, but he can't save Daniel. Okay. That's the problem. He can't save him. So later that day in the evening could have been any time after 6, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no law of the king's signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. And the king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. We pointed this out several weeks ago, that phrases that is key to the whole book of Daniel as you read through it is this idea of being rescued. It was the dialogue that the king had with the 3 Hebrew children, that their God would rescue them. Daniel here is having a dialogue about being rescued, and it's actually brought out one other place in the book of Daniel. Why is that in the book? Because Daniel is talking about a people because he's writing to people who are being persecuted and who are in bondage. And what is their concern? Will God rescue them? Will God deliver them? So this is a great book for those who are going through a difficult time, trying to see hope in what looks like a hopeless situation. So the king says to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully. What an endorsement by a king that we don't believe was a God-fearing man. May he rescue you. So the story continues. So a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed the stone with his own royal seal. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Anyone else know about a tomb that got sealed? Yeah. Jesus' tomb got sealed. Interesting. And for the exact same reason, so that no one, in this case, would rescue Daniel. In the case of Jesus, it was so no one would steal his body. They were concerned because they had heard these rumors about him being risen from the dead, and they wanted to make sure that didn't happen, because someone, there was a conspiracy and they were going to steal the body and declare him risen and everything else. And so they thought, we'll solve this issue, we'll seal the tomb. Well, in the case of Daniel, they're going to seal it because they don't want anyone to rescue him. And so again, we see the impact that Daniel had on the king, because look at what the next verse says. And when the king returned to his palace, after having Daniel placed there his signet ring, put a seal there so they would know if it had been broken or not, he spent the night fasting. See, most religions of the world have fasting as part of it. Christianity is not the only one. And so they would fast, and the fasting took various different forms throughout. And so he did the only thing he knew to do. Again, we don't believe he was a follower of Jehovah in any way, shape, or form, but he was a religious man to whatever that looked like in his day. And so he was serious. He was devastated of what happened to his friend, if he could call him a friend. And so he's fasting so that something might happen in a miraculous way. He refused his usual entertainment. Now, I don't know if they had open mic night, in the palace. I don't know what the entertainment was, if they had a bunch of dancers come in, if they had people come and, jugglers and everything else. But he was so despondent. He just said, I don't want to see anybody tonight. We're going to have a quiet evening, which was totally out of character for him. And he couldn't sleep. Do we know of another person who couldn't sleep? In the story of Esther, remember? Xerxes couldn't sleep. And he was up all night. And of course, he's reminded of something, and something incredible happened in the story of Esther there. So he rose and tossed, can't sleep. He's been fasting, praying to his God, whatever, saying, my friend, I can't believe I was so stupid to do something like this. Whatever he was saying, may something good come out of this. So early the next morning, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Now, pause there before you read the rest of it. Why would he hurry to the lion's den? What are the chances that Daniel's going to be alive in the normal world situation? Zero chance. Why would you hurry to go find out someone's dead? Doesn't make any sense. So there must have been something in the heart of the king that says, maybe Daniel's God is who Daniel says he is. I've heard, I guarantee you, again, I'm speaking outside of scripture now, but I think, can't guarantee anything. I think the king probably heard some of the stories that happened when Daniel was in Babylon. I don't think that Daniel was a blank slate, that walked into the king's life. Otherwise, there's no rational thinking of why he would be in a position of influence if there hadn't been a bunch of discussion that took place about Daniel's life while he was in Babylon. So picture here, he's heard the story. He's heard the story about the fire furnace. He said the story about how God miraculously used him to reveal, the interpretations of dreams. Everything about Daniel is just not ordinary. He's a man that stands head and shoulders above anything else the king probably have ever seen. And so he puts him in a position, and now he runs. And he calls out, Daniel, servant of the living God. Interesting phrase. Was your God, whom you serve so faithfully? Notice this is a big deal. This is the second time. Before he gets thrown in, he says, the God that you faithfully serve. Now, as he's coming to the den, he says, whom you serve so faithfully. Was he able to rescue you? Again, we see that mindset here. So picture someone who's of Jewish descent that's out in the empire someplace. They're now reading this letter. They're hearing about maybe what's in the letter, and they're asking the question, can my God that I worship rescue me? Can my God save me? Can my God make a difference here? It was a message of hope to a people that, again, were hopeless. And so we see here, he's putting the words out of the king's own mouth. Was he able to rescue you from the lion's den? And then there had to have been pause. I guarantee you, no one was moving. Pin drop. Now, I don't know how long Daniel waited before he said something. If he was into theater, he might have waited 30 seconds, for the effect. Okay. But maybe he spoke right away. But immediately he says, Daniel answered, long live the king. Now, why did he start out with that? It's out of deference to the person who's his boss. He's wanting to know is, I'm being falsely accused of something that's crazy because, they believe that I have something against you, king. I'm all for you, and I'm going to show you. I'm not going to worship you. I'm not going to pray to you, but I'm going to let you know that I honor and respect you as my boss. Ever had a boss you couldn't stand? Or maybe that's too strong. You had lots of different viewpoints with them. And do we honor them out of their position? Even though sometimes some people are not worthy of that respect. And if it gets too bad, you leave. You leave. Well, Daniel can't leave, but long live the king. And then he gives the response, my God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that it would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in whose sight? God's sight. And I have not wronged you. Now he speaks from God down to you. Innocent, I haven't wronged you, king. I've done everything you wanted me to do. You wanted me to take care of the corruption in the land. You wanted me to give leadership. I've done everything you had to try to bring stability here, your majesty. Now, when the king heard this, the king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted his God. Again, think in terms who's hearing the story or who's reading this that's going through a difficult time. It says he trusted God. You're in persecution. You're in enemy territory. You've been sent into exile. Do you trust God in the midst of that? It's giving words of encouragement and hope to people that are in desperate situations. Now, this is interesting. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously done whatever they did to Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and their children. Now, I know I'm dealing with lots of Bible experts on this call. Can you think of something in the Old Testament where there was, and I'll give you a hint, there was a rebellion that took place, and when God decided to judge the rebellion, whole families were judged? No, well, that's the ultimate. It would be Moses. It would be Korah with Moses. I don't know if the whole family there was. That's a good one. I'll have to look that one up. But Korah, when he came to Moses, and Korah basically said, who are you to be our leader? Anyone can be the leader. And he was challenging the authority of Moses being their leader. And Moses was devastated because Moses basically had done everything he could to kind of keep these 2 million plus people together. And so Korah led a rebellion, and there was several hundred that were involved in the rebellion. And when God brought the judgment, there was an earthquake that came. It says those that were in the rebellion and their families were. And I always felt like, if you ever had a view that the God of the Old Testament, and I believe it's also the God of the New Testament, but if the God of Jehovah is a harsh God, those stories might give you some credence for that, because you say, why do you do the whole family? The reality is that more than likely this is a mindset that wasn't just indicative of the people that are spoken of, the ones that were challenging. There was this whole mindset within this community that's taking place, that they were out against the Jews and they were out against. And so if that's true, don't know if it's true because the Bible doesn't say, then it makes a little bit more sense. But the fact is, whole families were judged here. And the lions leaped and basically ate them before they hit the floor of the den. So it wasn't because they were not hungry. They were hungry. Now, interesting, the psalmist gives us a picture. Psalm 7, verse 15. They dig a deep pit to trap others, then fall into it themselves. Interesting. Now, I don't know that the psalmist, because it's long before the Daniel story, but it's a principle that many times people who lay traps for others end up falling into their own snare. That's why I think we as Christ followers, we want to be people of grace and mercy, because I'd love to fall into that trap. Snare. Because what happens is when we go to try to get even, or when we go, it changes our countenance, it changes our perspective, it changes our behavior, and it ends up coming back at us in ways we do not foresee. You want to experience kindness, be kind. You want to experience forgiveness, forgive. Again, biblical truths that we have. Now, the story doesn't end there. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. So basically, he's talking about every ethnic group within his empire got this message. Now, notice how he starts the message. Peace and prosperity to you. Now, I've had preachers who will use this verse and the one from 3 John verse 2 that talks about peace and prosperity be yours. May you prosper even as your soul prospers. And they want to talk about how we're supposed to be rich. This is a greeting of the day, folks. It has nothing to do with our financial situation. It basically says, may you have a fulfilling day. It's actually what the word prosper means. May you fulfill your desires and your purpose in your life. So he starts by greeting them all, peace and prosperity to you. And then he gives a decree. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. Wow, great doctrine and theology here. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He declares he does rescue. He does save his people, and he performs miraculous signs and wonders. So when your situation looks hopeless, you serve a God of the signs and wonders who rescues and saves his people. He has rescued Daniel from the power of lions, as that is his evidence of why he would say this. So he's a living God. Okay, he's alive. He's not an idea. He's not a philosophy. He's a God that's alive and relevant today. He endures forever. He's an eternal God. His kingdom, the word kingdom means sphere of influence. Sometimes we use the word kingdom to talk about a place where, reign, as if it's geography. But kingdom, when kingdom's used in the Bible, it's less about geography. It's more about what is your influence. Okay, so the kingdom of the Persians, where did the Persians have influence? The kingdom of the Babylonians, where did they have it? The kingdom of God, where does God have influence? And of course, Jesus said the kingdom of God is with us, within our hearts, because he is impacting our lives. He's influencing our lives. So his kingdom will never be destroyed. And his rule, which is another word for saying kingdom, his influence, his rule will never end. Tremendous theological truths underscoring what Darius said about Daniel's Jehovah God. So what are some insights as we close before we wrap up our study? Well, it ends by saying, so Daniel prospered. Again, not that he got financially rich over it. I'm sure he wasn't hurting being where he was at, but he prospered. He was successful. He managed to have incredible influence in two empires. But here, this part of the story is during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Remember, we talked about the fact that these two were overlap. Was one kind of the big king, and the other one was kind of secondary in the area there. History has a couple different ways of looking at it, but Daniel speaks to the fact that Darius and Cyrus were involved during the reign or the time of Daniel. Okay, I've already mentioned this. He's the living God. He's engaged with his people. He delivers his people. His sphere endures. It will not be destroyed, and his power will never end. This was kind of coming towards the conclusion of Daniel's thinking. He's giving them a series of stories with some visions thrown in to teach them this principle that there is a God who's greater than any situation you and I face. And his kingdom will last forever. It endures. It will not be destroyed. In fact, going back to Daniel chapter 2, his kingdom will destroy all the earthly kingdoms. Okay. It will reign. And so again, a word of hope. Now, we have a few minutes here, and there's one other vision I want to spend a little time on. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And that's the vision of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. This gets into, I believe, chapter 11 and 10, 11, and 10, 11. Okay. 2 years now have passed since the lion's den. Daniel now definitely is in his early 90s. Okay. And he's given another vision of a great war. One of the things, we talked about this before, that Daniel was concerned about is he knew that there were going to be other empires that were going to come up, whether he saw it through the Nebuchadnezzar's idol or his beasts from Daniel chapter 7. So Daniel was very much concerned about what does this future look like? When's it going to happen? All those kinds of things taking place. So he has this vision, and it says he fasted for 3 weeks. And at the end of the 3 weeks, he is visited by an angel to explain what will happen in your future to your people in the future. What people? The Jews, God's people. That's the specific. Now, application can be beyond that, but specifically, Daniel's thinking about the Jewish people. He has no concept about Gentiles at this point. He's only thinking about the Jewish people. So the angel comes and says, listen, this is what's going to happen to the Jews, to the Hebrews. Okay. And it's going to happen in the future. It concerns the future. And then he goes on, a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, in other words, when he's at the peak of his power, his kingdom shall be broken up. Well, this sounds a little bit like that animal that had the one horn that broke off. Most common interpreters think that Daniel is seeing a vision of Alexander the Great, okay, who had no heirs. So the kingdom is divided and broken up into 4 generals who fight each other. Now, the interesting part, if you look back at secular history, 2 of those 4 are very much a part of the Jewish life during the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. So if you study that period, study the Maccabees and that type of thing, which I do with my students, and we've looked at about a year and a half ago, is looks like he's describing someone that could be described as the king of the north is what we would refer to as Syria, because that was the big one. And the king of the south was Egypt. And they were constantly at war. Once those 4 generals settled, they all wanted to expand their territory. So they constantly were fighting. And guess who's in the middle of the king of the north and the king of the south? This little country called Israel, Judah. And so this is why this is an important part of Daniel's prophecy, because he's talking about things that are pertaining to what his people are going to experience. And that out of the king of the north will arise one who will exalt himself, but he will come to his end because God is going to do a number. Now, what does this mean? Well, there are 3 interpretations that are common, and I've read about everyone's interpretation, and they kind of fall within one of these 3 buckets. Okay, the first one is that Daniel is getting another vision. The 2 animals that were fighting each other, we got a vision of that. That was in Daniel chapter 7, I believe. Okay, and this kingdom, he's referring to the exploits of a king we know as Antiochus IV. He went in, he desecrated the temple, he destroyed, he killed 40,000 Jews, he banned, he tried to change the laws of the land. In other words, he tried to make the Jews Greek, tried to make them Greek. He instituted the Olympics, which were done in the nude, which the Jews wanted nothing to do with, but he forced it upon the people. He was just, from a Jewish point of view, he's a real piece of work. From anyone's point of view, I guess he's a piece of work. So that's the more common interpretation. There is also a widely held view that Daniel is getting a vision of what's going to happen with Jerusalem in 70 AD when they're destroyed by the Romans. The only problem I have with that is it doesn't seem to be consistent with this northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, okay? Unless you have to do a lot of biblical gymnastics to get to that. But it's a common view out there. The third one is that we have yet to see the fulfillment of that, okay? And by the way, there's not one of these that just overwhelmingly was common throughout history. In fact, if you study church history, the early church fathers and the apostles themselves actually believed option number 1. They believed that it was during the Greek period that a lot of Daniel was fulfilled. And yet they also realized there were some aspects of it that were yet to be fulfilled. Now, what is Duane Prashant's solution? They're all right. Now, why would I say such things crazy as that? I've said this before, but let me say it, and I put it in writing, try to be articulate here. The book offers hope to all future generations of God's people. It offered during Antiochus' day when the Jews were being devastated by the Syrian Greeks. It also would have offered hope to those in Jesus' day. We know that most of the Christian Jews, in fact, all of them, were spared the destruction of Jerusalem because of Jesus' prophecy, and he alluded to Daniel here. And so they found Daniel's words to be a source of hope and encouragement to them in their day. John picks up on many of the messages and visions of Daniel when he writes the book of Revelation. And so John is writing from the perspective that it's about Rome and future generations. So you can see a pattern here, even before we get out of the New Testament, that people are seeing how generations have seen Daniel as a source of encouragement to them when they have been going through difficult time. In fact, when you get to the Reformation, many of the reformers used Daniel to talk about what they were reacting to, reforming against within the Roman Catholic Church taking place. So again, generations. And if you read about people writing today, they're talking about, we're going to see the fulfillment of all this during our generation. My parents' generation said the same thing. My grandparents' generation said the same thing. Every generation is going to be able to see that. Why? Because purposely it's written in a way that it has application to any generation. So my point is, which one's right? They're all right. They're all right. And this is the point, that in Daniel, we see a pattern and a promise. What's the pattern? Humans and kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power and don't recognize God as the true God. So that's the pattern here. There's going to be kingdoms that are come up. First, it starts with Nebuchadnezzar, then it's going to be the Persians, then it's going to be the Greeks, then it's going to be the Romans. And God views them as beasts. They're going to come up because they're self-serving. They don't service. They don't recognize the Jehovah God. And so there's this pattern that's going to take place. And it's almost generational. You know, you could say at least every 100 years, you can, there's a Hitler that comes up, or there's a Mussolini that comes up, or you can go to previous. You can look at Napoleon. You can look at Nero. You can look at some of the Roman emperors. So every generation has been able to see and apply the fact that there are these kingdoms, these influences, these empires, these beasts, but God's still on the throne. That's the good news, because what's the promise? That one day God will confront the beast and he'll rescue his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. So that's, in summary, is the book of Daniel. Is through his own life experience, through the visions he had, he's trying to provide this message of hope that will endure, that will keep people focused, and that will give them a sense of destiny in the midst of what looks like hopeless situations. So how do we deal with oppressive governments? What did we learn from Daniel? Pick your battles when confronted. Ultimately, though, it's about being faithful, being consistent in our walk with God, being faithful during persecution. We saw that in several chapters. They suffered because human kingdoms have rebelled and become beasts. And that's why people here on this earth, as our nation continues to move further and further away from its Judeo-Christian principles, we feel more and more like we're on the outside looking in. It seems like every year we go and we look like looking in. This is the way most of the world has lived, because by and large, most kingdoms and have never recognized Jehovah, never recognized God. And so therefore they're going to be self-serving, and that's going to create some pressure and problems for Christ's followers. So the visions are to encourage patience and telling God's people that God will establish his kingdom, and the prayer that we're supposed to pray will come to fruition. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That is a prayer of hope. It's a prayer of kind of like, come Lord Jesus, come, that John does at the end of Revelation. This is my last slide. So Daniel, what's Daniel like? Integrity is everything. There have been all kinds of research done on what makes for incredible leaders. And one of the things that comes out is their authenticity or their integrity. Okay. They're people of their word. You can rely on them. They follow through. All of those things speak of integrity. Daniel was a man of integrity. 2, he engaged his culture. He did pick his battles. He didn't fight everything that came along, but he picked his battles where he felt like the cultural pressure was undermining the very core of his belief system. He was competent. He strove for excellence. And the fact is that you do a good job, usually you get promoted. That's a general print. It doesn't always happen. I always think of 1 or 2 examples, but the reality is you do your job, and you become competent and you do it with excellence. Most organizations will find a place for you. Daniel is a perfect example of that, even though he was not a Babylonian or he was not a Persian. Okay. Number 4, prayer is not optional. Prayer is not optional. We need to be praying people. We need to be people of the word, but we need to be praying people. And finally, how much of God can other people see in me? Okay. Jesus and Peter said that they may see your good works and glorify your Father, which is in heavens. Sorry about that. Oops. It just cut me out. Well, we'll stop the share here. I trust, now it won't even let me stop. I trust you have enjoyed our journey in the life of Daniel. There are lots of characters that I hold up as a model of what I desire to be. Daniel's one of them. I see people said when I was pastoring, and of course I also was working at Phillips, and then I started getting into management, and they said, how do you deal with those situations that, that maybe you could let your guard down and, compromise a little bit? And I said, I needed to make sure I was a man of my word, whether everyone saw me or they didn't see me, that there was a consistency there. And Daniel always kind of helped me to think about those things, that he stood faithful. He stood faithful. Now, you may not be experiencing things like that in your life, like Daniel did, but maybe you're experiencing the other thing why Daniel wrote the letter, and that was because you're feeling a little helpless or hopeless. May we be people of hope, but God. You can put anything you want before it. Describe your situation, but God. But with God, all things are possible, but God. But God. And Daniel again illustrates that. Daniel, will your God rescue you? 3 Hebrew children, will your God rescue you? Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. But they were always faithful to their God. Father, we thank you again for this life. Thank you for the example he's given to us. Thank you for the things he got us to think about as it relates to our own lives. May our focus be to you when we go through those difficult times. Keep us safe now as we come back together next week, as we begin our study on the life of Elijah. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless everyone. Have a great, great day.